Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this Infrastructure Victoria webinar. I'm very pleased that you can join us for this important conversation where we're going to be talking about decarbonisation of infrastructure and adaptation to climate change. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the various lands on which we are meeting and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and any who may be joining us today. Now, this is a really important time to have this conversation. Our changing climate is directly impacting the lives of Victorians, and we've got increasing frequency of extreme weather events like bushfires and floods and storms. And that requires us to think differently about how we adapt our infrastructure. At the same time, reducing emissions across all sectors is critical if we're going to transition to a net zero economy and maximise the job and export opportunities of decarbonisation. So today's discussion is really timely. Every 3 to 5 years, Infrastructure Victoria delivers an independent strategy to Parliament on the best use we can get from the state's existing infrastructure and what the new infrastructure is that we need to deliver where it's needed most. And climate change is one of the 4 key infrastructure-related challenges that Infrastructure Victoria has identified that we need to face in the coming decades. Now, we've opened conversation on engagement on the state's next iteration of the 30-year infrastructure strategy, which we plan to table in Parliament in 2025. And you can have your say on Victoria's infrastructure priorities through the Engage Victoria website. And we're going to be sharing a link for you on that. You can find out further details of how to participate in the strategy update at the end of this webinar. Now, I'm really pleased to be able to introduce the great panellists that are joining us this morning for this discussion. And we've got a diverse range of views that we're going to hear on both adaptation to climate change and emissions reduction. So we're joined by Professor Lauren Rickards, and Lauren is a professor at Latrobe University and an acknowledged expert on climate change adaptation. She was one of the authors of the Australian chapter of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's recent report. We're also joined by Dr. Scott Rawlings. Scott is Director of Science and Reporting at the Commissioner for Environmental Sustainability in Victoria. Now, Scott's kindly stepped in at the last minute this morning because unfortunately Gillian Sparks, who's the Commissioner for Environmental Sustainability, is unwell, and Jill, we wish you a rapid and speedy recovery. But we're really pleased that Scott can be taking part in this conversation as an expert on science and the indicators of climate change. And then we're joined by Duncan Paterson. So Duncan is Director of Investor Practice at the Investor Group on Climate Change. And so Duncan is able to bring us that perspective from investors around Australia and around the world on the implications of emissions reduction and climate change. Now, questions are open. You can see that you can have a look in the Slido chat function, which is at the bottom of your screen on your web page below the video screen. And what you can do is you can put in questions, but also you can vote for questions that other audience members put forward. And so please do so throughout the conversation. And then what will happen is I will weave some of your questions, particularly those that are the top rated ones, the top voted ones, into our conversation as we go through the hour. You might also see that we're trialling an automated closed caption service. So this helps people access their information, and you can switch it on and off by pressing the relevant button located on your video stream. So let's get started with a conversation. And what I'd like to do to kick things off is get a sense of, well, what do we mean by resilient infrastructure and a resilient state and the impacts that climate change is happening? And so I think, Scott, you might be a good person to start with this as the expert on the science. Tell us a bit about what environmental indicators there are that policymakers are using to understand the key risks that are arising from climate change, and how is that relevant to infrastructure adaptation to climate change risk?
Thanks, Jonathan. And I'd also like to start by just acknowledging the traditional owners from the diverse lands on which we meet this morning. I personally am coming from Wurundjeri land in Melbourne. So thanks for your question, Jonathan. So This is a timely opportunity for us to be having this conversation because similar to Infrastructure Victoria, working on a major strategy at the moment, the 5-yearly State of the Environment report for Victoria will be tabled in Parliament in the second half of this year. And we are currently working through the development of that report. So a lot of what I'll talk about this morning is in the context of what we're currently preparing. So in our State of the Environment reports, we work very closely with data custodians across government and in community, and with our stakeholder partners across NGOs, traditional owners, and other community groups to develop a suite of indicators to report on how Victoria is tracking in terms of a number of environmental science and sustainability issues. And to use a cliche, if you like, you do manage what you measure. So the importance of taking the time to develop and adaptively manage an appropriate set of indicators can't be underestimated. And it's central to the work that we do here at the Commissioner for Environmental Sustainability. And this is quite a first time that we've had an opportunity to develop a report with a commissioner working in her second term. So previous reports have always gone in a slightly different direction because we've had a new commissioner. But the great thing about this report that we're delivering this year is it really is a continuation of the discussion that we had with the Victorian community in 2018. And the indicators that we developed as part of that suite in partnership and co-creation with our partners are being brought forward into this report as well. And that's really critical because in an adaptive management cycle, it's really important that we have that continuity and that the stories that we're creating in this report and the narrative has that continuity in history. So let's then think about exactly, to Jonathan's question about what we report on in terms of climate and climate change. So we basically have 4 types of climate indicators in our report. We have what we call climate indicators, which tell us the story about how the climate is changing. So yes, it is getting hotter. It's generally getting drier, but it is interspersed, as we know from recent experience, with more intense rainfall events, and the sea level is rising. So we underpin all that we report on in the report with those critical climate indicators. But then we also look at what the climate change impacts are. And this is where we begin to get to that adaptation space, both in terms of environmental adaptation, but also in terms of social and infrastructure adaptation as well. So these climate change impacts indicators provide the context of the so what, if you like. So what do the climate indicators actually mean, and what is the impact on human and on environmental systems? So it's getting hotter, but what does that mean for planning infrastructure, such as housing? How do we, what decisions need to be made to adapt to what the science is telling us? And then thirdly, we then also report on, so with those 2 sets of indicators, we know what the climate is doing, we know what is happening, and we know what some of the impacts are. But the next thing that we need to know is how our climate is likely to change into the future. And this is critical work that we do with CSIRO, with the Bureau, to understand projections. And we have a number of projection indicators in our report. So these indicators tell us some important information around planning infrastructure, such as that there will be twice as many hot days in Victoria by the 2050s, in contrast to before 2005, where our baseline is set. We're also likely to experience more extreme, short duration rainfall events, but overall a decrease in water availability and a decrease in rainfall. And then finally, perhaps a bit to the side of our discussion today, but mitigation and abatement indicators are just as critical in terms of understanding adaptation. And you can't have a conversation about adaptation without understanding mitigation and abatement actions. So we also have a number of indicators that assess the government's performance and look at things such as greenhouse gas emissions and ozone and how we're tracking. And that section also does look at green infrastructure and also carbon sequestration, both on land, terrestrial sequestration, but also blue carbon sequestration as well. So the overall message that's coming out of these assessments that we'll be reporting on later this year is that we've seen some really good reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. And a lot of that's associated with the pickup of renewable energy. The government has met its target under the Climate Change Act of transferring to renewable energy, but it's a long way to go, and there's still a lot more work to be done, particularly in sectors like the transport sector. So, Jonathan, just before I finish, though, I think I've been focusing on the State of the Environment report and what will be included in that report. But we should also point out that we've just recently, in 2021, released a State of the Marine and Coastal report. Now, our legislation, our obligations for reporting are slightly different in that context, where we do actually have a legislative obligation to report on report on social and economic indicators as well. And I think one of the things that we're discovering, so for those of you in the audience that might be interested, I direct you to our website where all of our reports are, including that one from 2021. And we deal with some indicators in that report which are very central to our discussion this morning around the impacts on marine and coastal infrastructure in particular. And there's a number of really interesting studies there, particularly around inundation and the impacts of inundation up to 2100, particularly obviously to the west of the state and the impacts on some of the regional centres there. So I think that's really important information that we collected in 2021 to report on those indicators. And I'm sure Lauren might go to this space when she speaks. But I think it's really important that we begin to look at that, to go beyond what we've reported on in a coastal context and begin to look at those impacts across the state. And the government begins to acquire information and data to enable us to report on those impacts on a more statewide basis. Probably should have mentioned, Jonathan, just as I end, that the critical thing about our legislation, we have our own, the Commissioner has her own Act of Parliament. So we are independent of government, but we report on state government activities. And with our State of the Environment report, the government does need to respond in Parliament within 12 months. So it's an important aspect of our report is that the recommendations that we include in our report will later this year will require the government to make a response by late 2024.
Great, thanks very much, Scott. And that's really great context and a sense of what some of those environmental indicators are. So, Lauren, I'll go to you next. You've been thinking about infrastructure and adaptation, and there are a range of externalities or side effects that can need to be considered when we build new infrastructure or we make changes to existing infrastructure. And some of the things we certainly hear about are things like biodiversity and sustainable development in the course of infrastructure upgrades or new infrastructure being built. Do you think we need to expand our horizons when we're thinking about resilience beyond, just the impacts of human-induced climate change and just the impacts on people?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Jonathan, and thanks, Scott, for that introduction. It's great to be working with Scott and Gillian, the Commissioner and the Office there on these things. So the thing about resilient infrastructure is you have to ask what it's for. And so it's always infrastructure for resilience, for social resilience, for the resilience, of the planet going forward. And what that means is that we need to have that broader scope, exactly as you indicated. Infrastructure is about the provision of services. And we know that our ecological systems, our ecosystems provide a whole range of essential services. So there's a move now to actually reconceive of our waterscapes, of our airscapes, of soil, trees as infrastructural, in that they are in sufficient quantities and able to perform at a high level, are able to provide the services that we need. So in a sense, they are part of the infrastructure conversation. But unfortunately, when we often think about physical infrastructure in the conventional sense, those things slip away to, as you use the term, externalities. But if we actually have that broader view of, well, how are we actually creating, maintaining, operating infrastructure for overall collective resilience, collective well-being, then all of those things kind of in the matrix, the surrounding areas around the infrastructure have to be part of that conversation in a way that's not just an add-on or a co-benefit, but actually core to that question of how we actually providing these services. So when we do all of that, we, of course, start to see a whole range of other things that often slips out of view when we think about infrastructure from an asset-centred approach. We need to actually think of, in terms of a people-centred approach, by which I mean thinking about all the people required to actually provide those services, the people that receive services. And of course, we all know that any sector that we're in relies on the services provided by other sectors. So you just think about all of the things that are having to function right now for this webinar to be working. You know, there's a huge amount of interconnected parts that are needed there. And that includes, of course, you know, our important institutions that help set the frameworks and for the successful running of infrastructure and the services they provide. So that's just a sort of an indication of the kind of broadening that we're seeing in a lot of parts of the world when we're talking about infrastructure, really stretching across to services, stretching across to consider the role of our ecosystems, and of course, taking that people-centred approach.
Great, thanks, Lauren. And Duncan, we'll go to you next. You're from the Investor Group on climate change, so it'd be really great to hear your perspective on resilient infrastructure, and in particular, where should asset owners and fund managers and governments focus their budgets to build greater resilience into both the new and existing infrastructure that we have?
Thanks, Jonathan. And just noting that I'm coming to you today from Yidinji country in far north Queensland, and acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging. So it's really interesting hearing Lauren talk about the way that the thinking is evolving around infrastructure. The topic broadly of climate change has been on the radar of investors for something like 20 years now, and investors have got quite a lot of infrastructure at that industry level built up around how they assess portfolio risks around climate change and what sort of steps they're taking to manage those risks. The IPCC Investor Group on Climate Change represents almost 100 investors who manage something like $30 trillion across Australia and New Zealand together. So investors have a key responsibility to play a positive role in these conversations around transitioning to a net zero economy. We recently did a report called the State of Australian Net Zero Investment, where we surveyed a range of investors on a number of different topics related to climate transition and net zero. And we found that while 70% of respondents actually had published net zero targets, only 22% of respondents had published approaches or targets related to physical risk across their portfolios. And that was a super interesting finding from our perspective. And out of that total group, only 9% had actually reported taking action on those risks. So I think to an extent we're at the start of the journey from the investor perspective on this specific issue of how you take into account physical risks of climate change. A lot of work is being done at the moment in various jurisdictions around the world, looking at how investors should approach this issue. What are the best tools they can use? What are the best approaches they can take? For example, the IPCC has a working group session that we're running next week, where we're introducing some of our local members to the latest guidance that's coming out from Europe on the impacts of physical risk on infrastructure in particular as an asset class. One of the leading approaches has been developed by our European partners, the International Investor Group on Climate Change. And it's not surprising they've done a lot of work on this topic. I think to an extent in Australia, things like drought and so forth, we can get a bit blasé about that. And we can, there's an element of the boiling frog syndrome. We're quite used to seeing pictures of droughts, and we're quite used to seeing bushfires, despite the catastrophic ones we've had recently. I think what came as a really visceral shock to a lot of people in the last year or so was the sight of drought in Europe. In the heart of green Europe, riverbeds running dry was a real eye opener, I think, and has changed a lot of the thinking around the physical impacts of climate change. And what was striking was that the droughts and the impacts on those river systems hit so many different levels of the economy. And this goes back to the point that Lauren was making. We think about climate change having an impact on physical infrastructure. We think about storms. We think about direct impacts. But when the serious effects of climate change start to play out, they're going to impact on a great many different sectors of the economy, not just the sort of business as usual suspects in this area. What the IGCC put together was a report looking at 6 specific levers that are there for investors to work on this topic. So integration of physical risk and opportunities into investment processes is one. Actually looking at strategic asset allocation and how portfolios are constructed is 2. Asset alignment, engagement and stewardship is a really critical one. Investors do speak with a strong voice, and making sure that that voice is heard and is playing a positive role. Investment in adaptation solutions. So one of the things we're really trying to drive here is development of a set of options for people to invest in that contributes to solutions. Policy advocacy, so not just communicating with companies and asset managers, but also communicating directly with policymakers is a critical one. And then finally, transparency and disclosure. And this last one is really, I think, where a lot of attention is going to be focused in Australia in the next 6 to 12 months, because we're seeing a lot of pressure coming through from government regulators on the topic of greenwash and how investors are telling this story that actually matches up with the reality of what they're doing on the ground.
Yeah, and Duncan, I think what you've drawn out for us there is the challenge that we've got of decarbonisation and emissions reduction on the one hand, and the significant effort that's underway to do that. Yet at the same time, we're now seeing the effects of climate change and the need to start real adaptation actions now, and the need to do both the decarbonisation and the adaptation at the same time. I'd be interested in your perspectives on what decarbonisation looks like in practical terms, not just for the assets themselves, which obviously investors are focused on, but also the communities that surround them. And tell us a bit about the degree to which investors are paying attention to those issues as we go through the decarbonisation process.
No, that's a great question, Jonathan, because I think people often think about the investment community as quite a monolithic sort of entity, but in reality, a range of different players in the investment community report back to a range of different stakeholders. So particularly if you think about things like industry funds who represent particular sectors of the economy, who have lots of employees who are employed in regional areas which are exposed to climate transition risks and things like that, that there's a lot of pressure on investors to not just think about the economic and financial implications of climate change, but also to think about the impact of climate change and the transition steps we need to go through to resolve the challenge of climate change on communities and on the people who are living in areas impacted, but also who are employed in sectors that are going to be facing transition. You'll probably hear a lot about the phrase talk about the phrase just transition. So this is a critically important process whereby when we do think about climate change and we do think about transitioning the economy to a more resilient and a more climate-friendly economy, we also bear in mind the impacts that those transition steps have on local communities. The Investor Group on Climate Change is on the record as supporting the establishment of a National Transition Authority, which will guide the federal government in making decisions around how we plan out the transition. At the moment, there is a risk that we take policy decisions around industry futures and so forth in isolation without also thinking about the implications of those. We need to protect the vulnerable in the community. We need to avoid disproportionate impacts on low-income households. And we need to successfully transition workers and communities to future employment opportunities.
Yeah, thanks, Duncan. And that's certainly something we hear from our stakeholders in Victoria. But it's not just a technical challenge of decarbonisation, it's the impact that it has on the broader community as we go through that process. Lauren, going to you next. Duncan touched on asset management and stewardship of assets and the role that owners have. From your perspective, how do you think that climate risk should be incorporated into infrastructure asset management and the cycle that there is of managing infrastructure assets?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I guess one of the main questions is to ask really, really hard questions about what infrastructure we need. And that goes back to that question that, the whole end game here is collective well-being. So we really need to be asking about the necessity and the spatial distribution, the equitability of that infrastructure in the first place. And once we do that and we assess, where we have existing infrastructure, the next thing is about, well, how can we use what we have? How can we avoid the need to create new infrastructure unnecessarily, acknowledging, of course, that part of adaptation will, just as Just Transitions does from a decarbonisation perspective, will require decommissioning and relocation and moving away from some areas that are too high risk. So when we've done that, then we need to, clearly think about all manner of ways in which the emissions are incorporated. So that's the embodied carbon in the construction, of course, the operational emissions, and also the emissions that any form of infrastructure is actually encouraging through the kind of services that it's providing. And so thinking through about how we can actually systemically try to use infrastructure sort of in a smarter way to actually reduce our overall collective emissions. So that means moving away from that, per unit, even a sort of spatially bounded effect, to looking at it more systemically. One thing I would really emphasize is that, climate change impacts are really damaging, just to state the obvious. And one of the ways they're really damaging is that they're very destructive. They create a lot of waste and they can generate a whole host of emissions directly and indirectly. So I'm not just talking about the problems with ecosystem destruction through floods and fires and droughts and the huge pulses of emissions that come out of that, but just thinking about all of the waste material that's created in some of these extreme events, as well as that rebuild necessity that comes with it, which often, which builds in extra emissions as well. And so it's just to make the very obvious point that adaptation is a route to reducing emissions. And we really need adaptation for that reason, also to enable the hard work of mitigation. We all know we've got a lot to do. We have a whole lot more to do when we add the big decarbonisation agenda. We have more to do when we have the adaptation agenda. But at the end of the day, adaptation will reduce the amount of work we have to do, the extra amount of work, because it's actually about trying to break the circuit of this escalating level of repair and recovery that we need to do. So just to point out that we talk about mitigation and adaptation separately, but adaptation is a route directly and indirectly to mitigation and reducing emissions.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, isn't it, Lauren? The synergy between adaptation and decarbonisation or emissions reduction, and that there can be some really strong co-benefits for both. And what we often hear is some opportunities in areas like blue and green infrastructure. And Scott, I'll come to you on this shortly. This is a question that's come through from our audience, and please keep the questions coming. There's some great questions coming through. And Victoria's 30-year infrastructure strategy points to the opportunities with tree canopy cover, particularly in the north and the west and the southeast of Melbourne, where there isn't a lot of that tree canopy, and that there's lots of benefits for that, of which part is the adaptation to climate change. And Scott, you mentioned earlier work you've done at the Commission on waterways and bays. So tell us a bit more about the role that blue and green infrastructure can have, both on emissions reduction, but also its importance in adaptation.
Yeah, great question, Jonathan. Thank you. So one of the critical things that we reported on in the State of the Marine and Coastal Environment Report was the resilience and the adaptation of those intertidal vegetation. So critical ecosystems of mangroves, salt marshes, and intertidal vegetation. Now, they are, as most people know who live on our coast and live near mangroves, they're incredibly resilient species, and they will adapt to rising sea levels. Unfortunately, though, we need to think about how we support these species. And one of the difficulties that intertidal vegetation will have as it adapts to rising sea levels is that, of course, our state has a beautiful coastline, and we've developed a wonderful infrastructure around our coastline so that people can access these beautiful parts of the state. But the intertidal vegetation, of course, can't cross the roads. So how do we deal with the natural resilience of these species, but be able to come up with innovative infrastructure solutions to be able to assist them in their adaptation and assist them in their resilience? And I suppose there are similar situations in inland Victoria as well, with how do we deal with connectivity and biolinks for our terrestrial species. And we've seen some innovative solutions there as well, with creating built infrastructure that assists with bridges over roads and things like that, which will enable the connectivity and the transition of species. So these are the things that we do need to think about going forward and being innovative in our infrastructure.
Great, thanks, Scott. And one of the other things you mentioned in your introduction was around the task of transport emission reduction, which is, about 20%, 25% of the state's emissions, and there's a lot of effort going on in terms of decarbonisation. I wonder, Lauren, if you'd like to talk from your perspective about the opportunities and challenges there are with the transport sector, both in emissions reduction, but also the role that shifting of modes from private vehicle travel to active travel or public transport has, and the degree to which that's relevant to, as you were saying before, the synergy between emissions reduction and adaptation, and to some degree community resilience in how we get around.
Yeah, for sure. So, just to acknowledge it, I probably hand over to Duncan a bit here too. But look, when it comes to transport, I suppose my starting point is always to step back and just ask the why question. So, just really putting in place the question of what, is a lot of our transport, what are a lot of those trips for? And how can we actually design them out in the first place? And there's a huge amount of fantastic work going on in the spatial planning area to actually really try to reduce the need to move stuff around, including people, but a lot of also just stuff. And of course, reduce the time it takes as well, and that particularly in regards to road travel. So when we sort of started to do that and started to look at that spatial footprint, noting that, of course, that under climate change, both from an impacts perspective and a decarbonisation perspective, we're talking about major spatial reordering of society, really quite profound. Once we start doing that, then, of course, you start getting to the question of modes of transport. And here, we know that there's a whole range of solutions that are coming through in terms of different fuels, and particularly the electrification of the transport sector. And that is an absolutely essential part of it. But, again, it's the kind of less sexy, low-hanging fruit that I think is the really crucial questions. In particular, active transport, we know, is really essential in terms of reducing emissions, but also improving human health, often building community connections, the pedestrian access, the safe bike access. These are where we can get those synergies between adaptation and mitigation. That's where we really can make some massive steps forward. And although, it sort of does start to drift away from the infrastructure question, at the same time, as a very keen cyclist myself, I can say that good quality bike infrastructure, including really good quality bike paths, might not be rocket science, but absolutely makes the difference between whether or not you can particularly move your children around, move around in a way that's actually in a functional, not just recreational sense. So I'll leave it there, but certainly there's a lot that can be gained in the transport space, particularly in conversation with those other sectors.
Thanks, Lauren. And your point about the safe separated cycling lanes being something that really opens up active transport to a wider range of people is very consistent with our research and recommendations to government as well. Duncan, I'm going to turn to you and let's start talking about money. Who pays for this stuff? Or perhaps to put it more constructively, asset owners and fund managers are going to have to make investment decisions in coming years. And part of that, many of them are probably thinking about the effects that climate change and resilience and adaptation and capacity of the assets, what they are. And so tell us a bit more about the sort of considerations that asset owners and fund managers are taking into account as they make their investment decisions in coming years.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point, Jonathan, and I think we haven't talked about it enough. The climate transition is not just going to bring risks, it's also going to bring opportunities. What we've seen in Australia and various jurisdictions around the world is post-COVID, a wave of investment boom in infrastructure. The US's Inflation Reduction Act, the European equivalents, and the opportunity has been seized by many regulators to build climate resilience and climate awareness into that process. And we're talking about investment of very, very significant amounts of money into the economy to transform existing infrastructure and to rebuild the way that we organise our communities and the way that we organise different industry sectors. That economic activity is going to provide a lot of opportunities for investors to go in and make money. People, when we talk about the time horizons involved here, it's often acknowledged that institutional investors, particularly in Australia, have been quite progressive in their thinking around climate change and quite early adopters of approaches to mitigating portfolio risks and so forth. And this is because they tend to have very long time horizons. Our members are thinking about investment risks, not just today, not just next year, but we're talking about being able to pay off the needs of beneficiaries in 20, 30 years' time. So it's critically important for an institutional investor to have that longer time horizon, to be thinking further into the future about what the implications of these sorts of things are. We've recently done some work with Pollination, looking at emerging climate technology and how different jurisdictions around the world have acted to foster the growth of green technology and investment opportunities. And there are some really interesting findings coming out of that report, where the approach was that we looked at various jurisdictions around the globe that have done well in terms of growing a green economy and growing a green sector, looked at the policy settings that they had that were common across those different areas, and then taken that back, obviously, and compared it to the policy settings we have in Australia. One of the key findings, the number one finding, was policy certainty. And I think we're all aware of the climate wars and the impact that that's had on Australian progress in this area for the last decade. And again, that was one of the key findings that came through in our State of Net Zero in Australia report, was that the two big asks that investors had were, number one, policy certainty and a good steer from policymakers as to the direction we should be headed, but also secondary, more local opportunities to invest in solutions to climate change. Some of the other findings that came out of that Pollination report were policy settings around things like R&D, incentives, things like we have this peculiar obsession in Australia with not wanting to pick winners. we have this expression, policymakers can't pick winners, right? And I think they've succeeded in that objective. They haven't picked any winners. They also they tend to not be picking the next emerging industry and supporting it. We see when we look at jurisdictions around the world, that isn't a problem. I mean, jurisdictions around the world that have done well in terms of developing a strong green economy, lots of green jobs, that sort of thing, have actively gone out and identified sectors that they want to support and they want to foster the growth of. And another one of the findings out of that report was that notion of blended finance and risk sharing. So having policymakers play a role in taking on aspects of the riskier elements of emerging technologies, because we really are going to have to, that was a point that Lauren made earlier on, which I think is a very strong point. We really have to do some hard work and make some hard decisions in the next few years. And that is going to involve, supporting industries which mightn't be immediately economic, but will almost certainly pay off in the longer term.
Yeah, that's fascinating, Duncan. Thanks. And what comes through really clearly there is the role that incentives play, both now and also that incentives for longer-term investors might be different to short-term investors, because the longer-term investors, like the super funds and others, are thinking about the reality of climate change adaptation and what are good options that they can exercise to prepare them well. And it's very much sort of thinking that we do in Infrastructure Victoria when we think through long-term strategies about having good options. So, Lauren, Duncan's talked about incentives. What do you think are the incentives that are needed to accelerate really meaningful adaptation to climate change? And are there particular things that the government and private sector should be doing to prioritise their efforts to adaptation?
Well, I think that the main incentive, clearly is the benefits that we can gain in the near term as well as the long term. It's been proven time and time again that the time horizon is just kind of, it's a bit discombobulating. We can't kind of quite motivate ourselves to get through what we need to do today in order to necessarily focus on these really long-term goals. But what we can do is understand that it's always going to be creating benefits right now. So just to come to the just transitions point, for example, we know that the communities that live in areas of high fossil fuel production, suffer from low air pollution, low air quality. And, the Commissioner for Environmental Sustainability, the State of Environment report makes that point very, very clearly. And so by reducing the amount of combustion going on in those areas, you're immediately alleviating one of the major sources of vulnerability. We talk about those communities as vulnerable, but it's partly because of the externalities of the industries that dominate in those areas. Same for reducing car transport, petrol-based car transport as well, diesel fuels in the city. These things have immediate and urgent benefits. What I would say is that those vulnerabilities aren't just sitting still. Those vulnerabilities are actually increasingly consequential under climate change. So it's not just that climate change kind of creates an opportunity for us to generate co-benefits, but adaptation in and of itself has to address these as a matter of urgency. When we talk about climate change impacts, it literally is an impact between a climatic-related stressor and whatever is existing in the world at that point in time. And so all of these existing circumstances, the fact that we have these air pollution loads, the fact that we have all sorts of other environmental sustainability issues, these are worsening climate change impacts. So one of the first things we can do for adaptation is what's called vulnerability reduction, which is kind of just do all the good stuff that we know we ought to have been doing for a very, very long time. So if, climate scenarios aren't your thing, if you find all of that, completely confusing and you wouldn't be alone with that, you can make a huge amount of headway simply by reducing existing sources of vulnerability. The other thing I would say is that in addition to climate risk management, which of course is crucial, we really, really need to prioritise the construction, the cultivation of resilient systems in the sense of resilience as a complex adaptive system. So we're talking about doing exactly what we're doing in this webinar, sharing information, reaching across the boundaries that silos create, actually learning continuously as we go, really putting in place a whole lot of ways in which we can simply work better together. And so when you put all that together, I mean, there's no reason not to start today. So doesn't quite answer your question of priorities. And just on that, I mean, I guess what I would say, without kind of wanting to specify that, you know, we need a such and such asset in this part of Victoria type question, because that, of course, is something that requiring careful research. What I would say is that you can get a long way simply by remembering that risk is always the intersection of probabilities, but also consequences. So the probabilities, that's where you have your climate risk maps and you start to look at all of the different risks that are here and in the future, as well as where the existing vulnerabilities are, and I've touched on that. The consequences side of it, that's where we have to think really systemically. So what is it about our existing systems that really help hold us together? What is it that, if it's impacted, has ricochet effects on and on, rippling through all parts of society? And to come back to the infrastructure aspect of that, it's interesting that in the US, they now have focused on what they call national critical functions. So they've shifted away to focusing on functions. What are the functions that we need to sustain to actually continue to function as a society? What are the ones that are most consequential? And when you look at that and you start then feeding back towards infrastructure, you know, it's unsurprising, given we're here on a webinar, that electricity and data centres tend to be caught up at the heart of most other sectors in society. And we know that electrification is at the core of mitigation as well. So certainly making the electricity sector and our ICT sectors more resilient is a really no-brainer. And then I'd also say, of course, the social side of it, the people, our ability to perform, to do our jobs, to keep the sectors that we're in and the sectors that rely on us going, require us to be functioning. And all of that means that we need to, you know, really look after each other and look after ourselves. So that's really resilience at that community, household, family, and individual level as well.
Yeah, and Lauren, there's some great questions coming through from the audience that I think probably dive deeper on that issue. So the questions that are coming through are around the role of the community and the community's knowledge and involvement in adaptation efforts. So you might want to say, it might be Duncan or Scott that you want to add to this, but what do you think are the opportunities for local communities to participate in efforts around adaptation and resilience building, and on the other side of it, the degree to which there's preparation and knowledge around the scale of change that communities are going to face with the effects of climate change and the adaptation we need to undertake?
Well, absolutely. So community resilience is absolutely foundational to our ability to keep functioning, and it's the kind of end goal at the same time. What I would say is that when we help to address community resilience and to kind of to utilise at that point I was making about kind of building general resilient sort of connections, resilient systems, reducing existing vulnerabilities. So things that we know are not going well already is really, really crucial. And also just to escape the kind of somewhat myopic view that we can fall into sometimes in terms of assuming that by communities we mean place of residence, and we talking about places that are somehow sort of spatially cut off. And certainly that can be the case if you're in a small, distant rural town, but we're part of a whole lot of communities, and we need to think about community resilience in accordance with all of those, including professional communities, communities of practice. We need to understand that even in the case of a geographically isolated community, that the resilience of that community is reliant on so many far-reaching networks and systems as well. So it's absolutely core, and we need to have a sophisticated notion of community at the same time.
Thanks, Lauren. And Scott, the Commission obviously engages with communities a lot in its work. What are you hearing about this issue?
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. I think Lauren's spot on. We did some work for the State of the Marine and Coastal Environment Report, looking at which of the indicators are critical for local communities. And we did work with key agencies that work at that local level. And for us as reporters, I'll give a reporter's perspective. It's really critical, the role of the citizen scientist. We're recognising now the importance of precinct reports. We now have in our legislation a State of the Yarra report, a State of the Great Ocean Roads report, where we're recognising the importance of not only having a statewide perspective on a number of these issues, but also being able to report locally. And the local communities become critical in our ability to deliver reports like that. Where does local knowledge come from? How do we create stories, local stories regarding these really critical, global issues, but how do they operate at this local level? And so therefore, citizen science becomes really critical. And that's an infrastructure question as well, because it's a question about technology. It's a question about, do we have the systems in place, the infrastructure systems in place to enable people to be able to generate knowledge and share knowledge?
Yeah, absolutely, Scott. Now, for those of you who are watching, a poll is now open below the video stream. You'll see that option next to the Q&A form. And it's just a short poll with 3 questions, which we'd really like you to fill in so we can help keep improving our events. And if you've got any ideas for future topics, we'd also love to hear about those too. So in the closing minutes of this webinar, please take the opportunity to fill that in. And we've got some great questions still coming through. One of the questions that we've got is about the intersection of water and energy. They're both areas, Lauren, you've talked about resilience and adaptation of the energy sector being a no-brainer. And then there's obviously the intersections in terms of both emissions from the water and energy sectors, but also their resilience. Would you or Duncan, you'd like to add any views around opportunities there are in that intersection between the water and the energy sectors?
There's so much to talk about on this particular topic. One of the main sources of renewable energy globally has always been hydropower, and obviously that's quite closely tied to availability of water. There are often controversies that arise around the proposal to build new hydroelectric facilities, given the inundation of land in what is increasingly scarce areas of biodiversity that we need to protect. So there's challenges around that. And it's also not often recognised that the water needs of our critical energy infrastructure as they currently stand are very high. So coal-fired power stations, for instance, rely on quite a lot of water in terms of their ability to function, keep their systems cool. Lots of talk around the edges about the exploration of nuclear power as a potential energy source in Australia. Very, very high user of water, needs to be co-located with readily available water sources. So I think there is a strong intersection between the availability of water, living on a continent where water is one of the assets that we really need to value and protect, and then looking at which of our energy sources are the most water intensive. And the beauty of renewable energy sources, primarily solar and wind, is that they have almost no direct impact in their operation on water supplies, and they have no fuel costs going forward. So I think that's worth bearing in mind.
Yeah, some big opportunities there, Duncan, and regular watchers of the IV webinars will note that we had a webinar last year with a number of water sector CEOs and managing directors who were also pointing to some of those opportunities that you talked about, Duncan, and the real synergies between energy and water. We've got a few minutes left, but Lauren, I want to give you, I suppose, the last question. You do a lot of work around the world and look at all sorts of things that different jurisdictions are doing doing in terms of adaptation to climate change. If you were to pick out, one or two that you think are really great opportunities that we could apply in Australia to meaningfully progress our climate change adaptation around infrastructure, what would be the big ones that you'd pick out? Are there any other no-brainers you want to draw our attention to?
Well, I mean, it's a good question. And look, I think, lots of jurisdictions tend to do well at certain parts of it. I mean, I've always been very impressed with Denmark. I think they, for a country of 6 million, do an incredible amount. And just the way they are able to really face this difficult question of incentives and ambition and policy certainty that Duncan brought up. So, they've set this the target of reducing their 1990 level emissions by 70% by 2030. And this is a country that, clearly has assets in the fossil fuel sector as well. And so they're really having to sort of face that down. And I think there's a huge amount of policy courage there. And when they're doing that too, they're also really focused on enhancing well-being at the same time. So they seem to be grasping that ability to approach decarbonisation as an opportunity to build adaptation, to build quality of life as well. And so they have some really excellent initiatives. There's huge focus on floods and sort of coastal erosion, given the character of the country. But they're doing a lot with nature-based solutions, which Scott mentioned earlier. So they're, really win-win solutions when it comes to actually mitigation and adaptation. So as hard as, I'm sure there's limitations to what they're doing as well, but certainly from where I sit, they seem to consistently be making really smart decisions.
Yeah, thanks, Lawrence. Great examples there we can learn from. We're always keen to take options from other jurisdictions and where it's applicable, apply them here in Victoria and do some analysis on that. And do stay tuned for some forthcoming research that Infrastructure Victoria will be publishing on some of the biggest climate change adaptation challenges for infrastructure in Victoria and some of the practical opportunities we've got to mitigate those as well. We're almost out of time, so I do want to take the time to thank our great panel. It's been a real privilege to have Lauren and Duncan and Scott with us today. As you will have gathered, there's an enormous amount of knowledge and experience that our panelists have been able to bring us. And as we love to do in these Infrastructure Victoria webinars, a diversity of perspectives as well across academia and government and industry that Lauren and Duncan and Scott have been able to bring to us. So thank you very much for your participation today. We really appreciate it. A recording of this webinar is going to be available on the Infrastructure Victoria webpage soon after the session. So if you or your colleagues would like to review some of the gems and insights and pick up on some of Lauren's no-brainers, then I'd really encourage you to do that. As I mentioned at the start of the webinar, we've launched a consultation and engagement on the next iteration of Victoria's infrastructure strategy. And a link is available to that in the Q&A chat function. And that's got further details on how and where you can have your say on what you think the biggest priorities should be around infrastructure in this state. I'd also encourage you to follow us on social media. In addition to our LinkedIn account, we've recently launched a new Instagram account, and you can get in touch with us at inquiries@infrastructurevictoria.com.au. I really look forward to seeing you at the next one of our Infrastructure Victoria webinars. Please feel free to be in touch, and I wish you a great day. Thanks very much. Goodbye.